Mr. Jacob, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
I was served in the United States Army, in the Quartermaster Corps, in the CBI Theater.
And what was your rank?
And my final rank was captain.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I tried to enlist in the summer of '41 in the Air Force. Was not accepted, but then I was drafted in September of '41.
And did you have a choice of which branch of the service at that point you could enter, or were you forced into entering the Army?
I think we were we were designated for Army. You had to enlist at that time to select your service.
And when was that? What year was that again?
1941.
And where were you living at the time?
I was living in Oakley in Cincinnati, Ohio.
How old were you?
I think I was 23.
What were you doing at the time that you were drafted?
Was attending the University of Cincinnati in the co-op program as a student.
Did you have a chance to graduate, or were you drafted in the middle of
Prior to graduation, yes. I didn't get my degree until '47.
Where were you sent for basic training?
Sent to Fort Francis E. Warren in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
And do you remember your training experience? Can you tell me a little bit about it? Was it difficult for you?
No, not really. We were in good training in administration. We were at what they called the administration school, which meant that it would be anything that would pertain to morning reports and sick reports and things like that, and all of the things like service records and anything that had to do with the administration of a soldier.
Did you have firearm training also?
We did, yes. We took, I think, 3 days on the firing range, and first night we were on the range, camped out in the little pup tents. You had your buddy, he had a half of a pup tent, and you had a half of a pup tent, and we set them up, and it went down to about 10 degrees below zero that night. And fortunately, I had a bunch of newspapers that my father had sent me from the Times-Star, and we spread those on the ground first, then the blankets and so forth. But it got to be, and we put our rifles between us to keep them warm, you know, that sort of thing. It was amazing. But the next morning, we got up and we tried to get out of our tent, and it was froze solid practically. But we got out, and however, the second and third and fourth nights, I think they set us up pyramidal tents, and they had a stove in them, and there were about 8 of us or 10 that could sit. We all slept toe to toe, you know, around a stove, but that was rugged going. But we did have about 3 or 4 days of arms orientation, both with the rifles as well as the handheld guns. We didn't have the M1s. I think we had the old airfields or something of that sort.
Did you have adequate supplies? You said it was really cold. Did they give you enough?
Yeah, we had good food and
clothing.
Clothing. Yeah, each one had 3 or 4 blankets. And
were your instructors difficult?
No, we had some regular Army folks who trained us out there, and they were very supportive. And I hadn't fired a gun in my life until I went out there. So you can imagine. I think my first shot landed about 35 feet in front of me when laying on the ground. It was amazing. And they had monitors all over the background there. We were on the range, and they would, the range was set up so that there was a deep trench down where the targets were. And every one of us had to work the targets as well as shooting. So those trenches were about, good 10, 12 feet deep. And then you would send the target up, see? And there was no way that you were going to get hit by a bullet, because there were targets, maybe 25 or 30 targets set up on the range. Then you could run those targets up and down. Then you were in communication with the people keeping score, and you would tell how many were in certain areas of that and how many were Maggie's drawers. You know about Maggie's drawers? Those were misses completely. So they called those Maggie's drawers. And you had to signal with a red flag how many of those Maggie's drawers, and that was a red flag. So that was the type of training in the pits. But up above, you had several positions that you had to learn to fire your rifles.
And how long were you in basic training?
I was in from mid-September of '41 until the end of January in '42.
Okay.
Now, see, the World War II was declared on December the 7th, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. And we were paraded out to our drill grounds, and it was about 15 to 20 below zero when we were out there on the parade grounds, and we listened to the president declare the war on Germany and so forth.
And then it was about a month later that you finished basic training.
Basic training was almost 2 months, from the 7th of December until the end of January, that I finished my basic training.
And where were you sent after that?
Panama. We went to, we were all in our wool clothes, naturally, and we took a train from Fort Warren down to New Orleans, Fort Jackson or Camp Jackson, I don't remember exactly. Jackson Barracks is what it was called. And we stayed there several weeks, during which time we were able to go into New Orleans and see the city and all those good things. And then we shipped out in I'm going to say the second week in February of '42, and took a transport. I think it was called the Cherokee or something like that. It had a sort of an Indian name. It took us 3.5 days to get down to Panama.
And was the Cherokee, I know a lot of the veterans that I've talked to were shipped over on luxury liners.
Mm-hmm.
Was the Cherokee a regular transport?
It was a regular troop transport.
Did you get seasick?
No.
No?
Fortunately, no, because I did a lot of sailing during World War II, but no, it took about 3.5 days, but I wouldn't go into my bunk down below in the regular service. I found a place up on deck that was inside a railing that I could put my bag and my blankets, and I spent about 3.5 days in the fresh air up there. My original bunk was going to be right outside of the head on the ship, and no way did I want to stay there.
I don't blame you. Did you have your orders at that time? Did you know what?
We knew we were going to. We knew we were going to Panama. Yes.
And then, what happened next?
Landed in Colon, it's Panama, and took a train across the isthmus to a post called Corozal, C-O-R-O-Z-A-L, Corozal, and assigned to the 41st Separate Quartermaster Company. Our job down there was maintenance of all of the vehicles and replacement parts for the Isthmus of Panama. Now, Panama was important because it was the canal, and it was the shortest route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You know all about the Panama Canal. And we were stationed right near the locks, and I can't think of the locks names right now, but it'll come to me. First thing I saw was a bunch of barrage balloons. Now, the barrage balloons were inflated blimps, small, maybe about 10, 15 feet long, and they would send up maybe 75 or 100 over the locks to prevent dive bombing of the locks in the Panama Canal, so that the canal was not wiped out during the World War II.
Did you see the enemy at that point?
None.
Was there any?
None at that time. There was no activity. We were stationed right next to a field called Albrook Field, which was fighter planes and no bombers, because we were not bombing anything out of Panama, but plenty of interception planes. Albrook Field.
And how long were you there?
Until early in September of 1942. I went before the officer candidate board down there. I was a private, and then later on a private first class. And one of the officers, a man by the name of Richard Huffman, he was a lieutenant in our company, and he said, you should go before the board, the OCS board. He said, you should be in the officer's rank. And I sometimes wonder if he wasn't part of the Huffman family up here in Dayton, who makes the Huffy tricycles and so forth. And I often thought about that. And Richard Huffman, and he was from Dayton, and that's where the Huffman company was from. But he told me to go before the board, and I did, and was ranked pretty high on the list. So I got my orders about the latter part of August of '42 to go to the Quartermaster School at Camp Lee, Virginia.
Oh, so you went back to the States?
Mm-hmm. Came back to the States. Came back on a United Fruit Company boat, and it took us about 2 weeks to get up there, to get back to the States. We put in the Bay of Guantanamo for 3 or 4 days because the German U-boats were operating in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico at that time. So we left. We were in Guantanamo for about 3 days. Didn't get off the ship.
Oh, okay. So you were sent back to the States for officers candidate
Mm-hmm.
training, and I'm assuming you finished that, and then what was your rank?
Well, after attending, and incidentally, we landed at New Orleans. That was the second time I'd seen New Orleans. We rode a train, crowded train up to, there were about 6 or 8 of us that came back at the same time. Went to Camp Lee, Virginia, where we were enlisted in the Quartermaster Officer Candidate School.
And what was your rank when you finished that?
I went in as a technical sergeant, and I came out as a second lieutenant.
Okay, and then Were you shipped back overseas?
No, no. From the first part of 1943, after we had a delay en route so we could come home and be with our families and so forth. I was married in the first of the part of December, shortly before we graduated, and we came home, my wife and I, and spent 28 days on leave. And then we went to North Carolina and started up the 3rd Battalion of the 478th Quartermaster Regiment. It was a battalion, it was a regiment of truck regiment, really. And the first 2 battalions were already in Burma and India, and we were the 3rd Battalion, so we started that 3rd Battalion up, and that was in roughly February, latter part of February, or first part of February of '42. And this was at Camp Sutton in North Carolina that we trained and manned and set up these 4 companies.
Okay. So you were still training at that time?
Training a new unit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were feeding personnel to us.
Okay. And then what happened?
Well, we took about until July of '43 at Camp Sutton in North Carolina. We trained and took the usual training of maintenance of trucks and etc. And took road trips, to how to run convoys, that sort of thing. There were about well, let's see, there are 4 company officers, and there were about 20 officers. We were assembled there at the Camp Sutton and given our assignments, and I was assigned as the assistant adjutant of the battalion. That was administrative. We had 4 companies, 4 officers per company. Since we were all 2nd lieutenants at the time, except the commanding officer and the executive officer, we were all freshly commissioned 2nd lieutenants. So the opportunity for promotion was very, very lucrative. We were able to go up through the ranks, and before I left the States on board ship, I got my first lieutenancy in the United States before we shipped out. So we trained the unit in Camp Sutton, North Carolina, and we were permitted to have our wives with us, and we could permitted to live off quarters and so forth. So of course my wife was pregnant early on, and we spent about, let's see, until December, until the end of May together. And but of course I had to go out I was at the post every day. Then first part of July, after I had taken my wife home and established with the folks at Fort Thomas that it would be wonderful if our child was born in the United States in the Army camp, and it was at Fort Thomas. So I must bring this in because it was a part of the whole episode. And my daughter Bonnie was born over at Fort Thomas, but I brought my wife home in May, and then I went back to Camp Sutton. One of the unusual things, and for your information, during those days the Delta Airlines used to fly out of Lunken Airport, And I took a airplane from, when I went back to Camp Sutton on my last trip home, I went Delta to Atlanta. Then I had to take a train from Atlanta up to Camp Sutton. But it was like a DC-3 in those days that they were flying Delta. And that was close to my home, and that wasn't anything like the old international airports that we have today. It was Blanken Airport. And from there we finished our training until about the first part of July, and then took a troop train across the United States over to out to California, Camp Anza, California. And we stayed there about 3 weeks getting this unit ready to ship overseas.
And then you went to the CBI Theater.
Yes, we boarded a... I got to show you this. I think I have this. I think. No, it's not there. Somewhere along here. I have a, here we are. I was on the USS Hermitage. It was a Navy transport, our unit. And this is my official, when you cross the equator, you become a member of, oh golly Moses, the Imperium Neptuni Regis. I'm going to show you that, and you might want to take a look at that. That was your initiation into the, along with all of the other sailors and so forth. Everyone on a ship had to be initiated into this crossing of the equator.
Well, who started this?
That was a Navy tradition.
Oh, I see.
Navy tradition.
I'll scan this later.
Do that. But that also reminded me of the name of the ship, the USS Hermitage. We left from Long Beach, California, on this transport, middle of July or third week in July, after spending 3 weeks at the Camp Anza. And we sailed alone. They were very comfortable traveling alone in the Pacific Ocean because it was a quick, fast ship. And they said they could outrun any sub or anything that could have been a menace. Now, as far as air transport to air attack, we were vulnerable to that. Our first stop was in Wellington, New Zealand. And it was winter down there because we're in the southern hemisphere. We left Camp Anza in July, which was midsummer. So we were midwinter in Wellington. And it was Wellington. We spent just 2 or 3 days down in Wellington. Oddly enough, when we marched our troops through the city to keep them, they'd been on board ship many weeks on that Hermitage, and trying to think, we were about 3 days in Wellington, during which time we would march the troops through the city and so forth to kind of get the cobwebs out of our minds. And oddly enough, one evening we were going to have a dinner at the Grand Hotel down in Wellington, and I ran into a Cincinnatian down there who our fathers worked together down at the Cincinnati Times-Star. He was window shopping. He had been with the Marines on all of the island landings, early on in Guadalcanal and so forth. He had been in all of those with the Marines. He was a medical. He was a medical officer.
Was he part of the Raiders?
No, this was the Marines, and they were island fighting down there and in the Philippines and later on in Guadalcanal and so forth. But he was an officer. He was a surgeon, and it was so funny. I walked up. I said, "Bill Deffinger." He said, "Frank Jacob." And our fathers worked together down at the Times-Star. It was almost like meeting somebody down in Wellington, New Zealand. And he was scheduled to come back to the States because he had contracted malaria down there several times. And he was going to coming back to the States, and he said, "I'm going to get in touch with your folks and tell them that." And my dad and Mr. Deffinger being Times-Star men, there was a big article about our meeting down there and how we met and all those good things. But that was in Wellington, and from there we traveled to Melbourne, Australia, and we weren't allowed off the ship. Then we went to Perth, that's in Western Australia, and we were allowed off the ship for a few days in Perth, and got to visit some people, and I had something here from some folks down in Perth. Maybe I don't have it with me. I don't think I do. I think it's some stuff I had with a Bible. But some folks took us to their home down in Perth and fed us and entertained us. And it was on the bay down around Fremantle. And that was one of our social things in Perth, Australia. Beautiful city, Perth, Australia. From there we sailed up to Bombay in India, and we just stayed over there overnight and got on a British troop transport boat, and came back down around India up the other side. One time we had to put in a port called Visakhapatnam because the submarines were active in that Indian Ocean there. Then we went on up to Calcutta, India, boarded a pilot before we went up the Hooghly River into Calcutta. And we spent a few days at a embarkation camp there, Camp Howrah. From there we took a railroad and took vehicles on flat cars, and we lived in those trucks until we got to our destination in Ledo. We went to up north India to the Brahmaputra River, of which you probably have heard, the Brahmaputra, and then debarked in that area and drove the trucks on into Ledo, where that was our base at that particular time, the base of the Ledo Road. The Ledo Road was to service the Chinese and American troops that were fighting prior to that, and during that time they were flying all of the supplies over the hump. You've probably heard of that episode. And the Ledo Road was destined to be the overland route into Kunming, China.
Were you in any of the fighting? Did you see any combat?
I did not see combat. We were support troops to General Stilwell's troops. We operated the airfields, the airdrops from, they came out of Chabla, India. One of our companies was back in Chabla, India. And we operated all of the supply lines of food and gasoline, the oil, airdrop fields during that time. We were close to the action, but we were not in it. And the Chinese troops and the American troops would come to our bases and pick up those supplies.
I'm assuming that before you went over, you had a lot of inoculations for this.
We
area.
did. We
Can you
did.
tell me what some of those consisted of? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think cholera, tetanus. God, we had one because they had an outbreak over there. I wish I had. I have one of the inoculation charts that I have at home. I didn't know that you would want that. Maybe I could get that to you.
Were a lot of the men getting ill from fevers? I know malaria was
We
prevalent.
took Atibrin every day of our lives over there. And we did have 1 or 2 cases of malaria. We did have one man die from malaria in one of the companies. Yes, if you'll notice on those pictures, all of our socks are tucked in our shoes, and I mean our trousers are tucked in, and that was the reason for that. We took a lot of Atibrin. We took a Atibrin tablet every day. If we were out at night going to a movie or whatever, we swatched our face and arms, the exposed parts, with insect repellent, and I wanted to say scat or something like that, but that's what it was. But it was a real highly sensitive stuff. It almost made you feel like you were on fire, and it was hot, uncomfortable, but it kept the mosquitoes off of us.
When I was reading one of Ernie Pyle's books, it was a compilation of his stories, he talks about the monotony in the Pacific, which he felt was worse than in Europe because of the sameness of the climate, the sameness of the days. Did you experience that feeling?
The sameness thing was rain, the monsoons. Everything was dripping all the time. We were in the jungles, and if you'd go into your cot at night, it almost felt soggy when you'd get into that sack, and we had the mosquito netting all around the cot, and we had to tuck that in all around our sleeping bags to make sure that. And then we took our aerosol bombs and sprayed in there before we signed off for the night, and make sure that the mosquitoes would be dead if there were any in there.
What did you do to keep yourself occupied? What kinds of things? How did you entertain yourself?
Well, are you speaking other than our duties, or
in your free time?
In the free time? Well, letter writing, of course, was the big factor.
And how often did you get mail? Were you getting mail?
We would get it in lumps. The packages and things like that came by ship, and they didn't come until months later. The letters came airmail, and you'd get maybe 6 or 8 letters at a crack. And you'd have to kind of arrange them into postmark date to make sure that you got them in the right order and so forth. Of course, I was looking early on for the most recent date because I knew when our youngster was going to be born, and I'd always pick up the latest one and see if anything had happened. And I knew when we got into Calcutta that, or shortly thereafter, that my daughter had been born.
It must have been difficult for you to be there and not.
Oh,
not
yes.
with her.
She was actually 2 years old till I first saw her when I came back from the service. But
What can you tell me about one or two of the most memorable experiences that you had during your time in the service?
memorable. A little difficult there. You're talking about my time over there.
Mm-hmm. Well, any time during your service.
During the service, okay. Seemed, we did have some fatalities. One of my good friends was killed in a motor accident. One of the officers in our company was killed in a motor accident over there in Burma. And we had a very touchy ceremony there when we buried him. I think one of the things that probably, during the construction of the Ledo Road, during the monsoon season, the weather was just terrible and rainy all the time, and the road had just been carved through hillsides, mountainsides, and so forth, and it was just a quagmire. And one of my duties as the battalion adjutant was to make sure that the companies were properly paid and so forth. And I can recall making many trips over the so-called Ledo Road myself, with maybe about $8,000 worth of Indian money in my knapsack, with a .45 caliber pistol on my side, trudging maybe 4 or 5 miles and seeing nobody over this plowed up road. And the officers and the other company would know at the destination ahead of us that I was on my way, and they would send a jeep or a truck to that point where the road was still passable, and then they would pick me up and I would go on in with that. But I remember, my recollection there was the smelling of the freshly mowed down trees and so forth, and the rain and so forth. And you'd look up and you'd see all these trees, and you'd say, hope there was no enemy up in there, because all you had was that little .45 caliber pistol on your side. But there was a little stress, but I did that several times, and that was while we were stationed in this hill station here, but that would be one of the episodes that you could remember that was unusual.
Did you make any really close friendships?
Well, they were all fairly new, to me. The officers were all new. Had made a friendship with some of the couple of the officers, and our wives became friendly because they were in training together. We were in training together. Some from North Carolina, and Lieutenant Kenton and his wife, and trying to think of some of the other. We had a small unit. It was a battalion. It was a small unit, and since we were all brand new lieutenants and we kind of chummed together, it was. But long-lasting friendships. Trying to think of if we did have any. Several Cincinnati people that were with us at the time.
Do you keep in touch with any of them now?
Trying to think. My mind's a little befuddled on this right at the moment.
Okay, that's all right.
Maybe we can come back to that, but it'll come to me.
What do you think was the most important thing that you learned from your time in the service?
Well, I think we learned discipline, respect for authority, loyalty. See, our country was invaded when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor. We had that sense of, if we weren't in the service, we wanted to be in, and the loyalty end of the thing was pretty predominant in those days. The civilian population was all for it. We didn't have the protesters that we're experiencing now. Al Nelson mentioned about the rationing and that sort of thing. People had their victory gardens and all that sort of thing, and so it was. Those are the things that I remember. We didn't fear death in those days. We knew that there was a job to do, and I wrote my folks when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was when it was attacked. It was a Sunday morning, and we were out on throwing a football around at Cheyenne, and somebody came out of the barracks and said, Pearl Harbor's been attacked. And I remember saying, where's Pearl Harbor? You know, we didn't, that was, of course it was Hawaii. But we soon grasped the necessity, and we were all pretty positive that we could polish it off in a hurry, but we were very naive about that. Our fleets had been taken out practically in Pearl Harbor, and we had antiquated aircraft. We were not prepared for a war. At least that was our feeling. We were tuning up for it because relations with Japan had become strained. The government found it necessary to have the selective service, taking civilians into the service. And but we were really willing to do whatever it took to protect our country.
Threw me for a loop just now. Is there anything that we haven't covered in the interview that you would like to add?
Well, going through the service and keeping in touch with my folks, we had the usual boxes sent to us, the cookies and the cigars and things like that. I remember getting a box of cigars that my wife bought me downtown at Strauss's, and that was a great thing. You know, we didn't get those kind of great things over there in the sticks, you know, and our food was adequate. Mostly rations in tins rather than dry rations. But once in a while, we were stationed near a bomber group, and they would run what they called a mercy mission down to Calcutta, and they would bring back ice cream and chicken believe me, chicken and ice cream. And they'd load the Bombay of the B-25 bombers with these goodies, and they would make sure that we got some of those things. We were adequately taken care of clothing-wise. The food, good. We had our own mess.
When your service was ended, what did you do? Did you go back to school?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I re-entered the University of Cincinnati in January of '46. There were about 25 of us that had come back that were in the same boat as I was in. And we prevailed upon a couple of our professors, because by that time we had families. And we had about the equivalent of 2 years to go yet. And we prevailed upon the powers that be to accelerate us and set up a special course. We went straight through from January until August, late August of '46, to get our credit hours in and so forth. And we didn't actually get our diplomas until June of '47.
And then what did you do as a career after the war?
After the service, I went into the accounting profession. From the Trailmobile company, they made trailers that were located.
I'm stopping to turn over the tape.
Went into the accounting profession, and it was various jobs, accounting to controllers, to treasurers. My second last job was vice president and treasurer of the Fox Paper Company, and my last job was administrator of a law firm downtown, Graydon, Head and Ritchie, and I spent 10 great years working with the law firm as their administrator.
How long have you been retired?
Since semi-retired since 1983, and fully retired since 1988.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Mr. Jacob, for taking the time to come in and be a part of this project.
If I can be of service, and I'll be happy to answer anything that didn't come up, and if you think of anything, you got my phone number and all those good things. You betcha.